Hey everyone, Dorian from Noesis here. Today we'll be creating a simple character selection screen within Noesis Studio. In the process, we'll learn how to drive an interface with data using the powerful ListBox element. Now what's really cool as well is that this tutorial has been built from the ground up to not require any assets. So all you'll need to follow along is a copy of Noesis Studio. If that sounds good and you're ready to go, let's get started. Our very first step is going to simply be to create a Noesis project where our character selector will live. So let's go ahead and create a folder which will contain it, and we'll call it character selector. Next, we can go ahead and open up Noesis Studio, and in the upper right hand corner we can click the blue button that says create new. We'll go ahead and select the directory that we made to contain our project, and we'll go ahead and name our file character selector. Next, we can go ahead and click on Create Project, and that'll open up Noesis Studio, and we're ready to continue with the initial setup all done. Now what you'll notice is that when creating a fresh project inside of an empty directory, Noesis Studio automatically generates a mainpage.xaml for us to work out of, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start by creating our base layout for our page, and then we'll start progressively introducing elements and then configuring them to suit our needs. So let's go ahead and start by first creating a 2-row grid to house our elements. To do that, we can either click on the grid within the navigator or directly on the stage, and then if we want to add a row, all that we would have to do is to hover over the left edge of the grid. You'll see that there is a cursor change with a little plus icon, and if we click anywhere along this line, it'll add a second row. Now we're going to go ahead and make these 1 star each, and what this will do is it'll make them proportionally equal. Now the star system is one of my all-time favorite design features within this framework, and it'll essentially assure that no matter what aspect ratio or what size, these 2 rows will always have the exact same height. Now the next step that we'll get to be able to do is to introduce the individual elements that'll make up our character selector interface. Now to do that, we're going to go ahead and navigate over to the far left in the application window to the Add Element tab, which you can also access by pressing Ctrl+2 on your keyboard. Now within this, we're going to go ahead and do a search for a grid, and we'll go ahead and click and drag that into our page, and this will be a background element that'll serve to reflect the currently selected character's unique visual. Next, we'll go ahead and do another search for a text block. Likewise, we'll go ahead and click and drag that in, and this will be a field that will display the name of the currently selected character. Last but not least, we'll go ahead and do a search for the list box, which will equally click and drag and place inside of our page. Now this element really excels at displaying data-driven content, and so we'll be using it to display the entire array of available characters to select from, as well as leveraging its built-in functionality, which will allow us to track and pass on to both the text block and the background image which of those characters is the currently selected one. So with all of the elements that we'll be working with accounted for, let's go ahead and spend a moment to rename them and also to adjust their properties to more intentionally position them within the layout that we've created. We'll go ahead and start with the grid, and we'll go ahead and rename this by double-clicking on it in the navigator and typing in selected character underscore visual underscore grid. And we want this to span the entire page, so we'll go ahead and check that it goes from row 0 with a span of 2, so it fills the 2 rows with a horizontal and vertical alignment of stretch. This is now good to go. If we move on to the text block, we'll go ahead and rename this as well to selected character name text block. Now what we want to do for this one is we want to be constrained within the top half of the page exclusively. So it is starting at the correct row at row 0, however we don't want to span 2 rows down, we want to span only 1 row down. So we'll go ahead and adjust this value to 1, and we can see that the bounding box has changed and is now contained within the top row only. Now we want to make some adjustments to our alignments in our text. So the very first thing is we want our text block to be aligned to the bottom of this row. So we'll go ahead and change the vertical alignment to bottom. And you'll see that has shifted down there. It's a little bit hard to see. So let's go ahead and increase the font size to 48. We'll go ahead and center align that text. And lastly, we'll add a little bit of a margin of 32 all around to give it some room to breathe. Now as we move on to the list box, we'll go ahead and rename this to characters underscore listbox, and with this one we want the opposite to happen. We want this to be constrained within the bottom row exclusively. So what we know is that we want to span 1 row, so we can immediately change the row span to 1. However, as you can tell, it is assigned to the wrong area, so we will simply change our row from 0 to 1, and now it displays in the correct quadrant. At this point, we're able to now go and have some fun with data before then plugging all of that into what we've created here. And so we're going to go ahead and navigate over to the far left of the application window and open the data panel, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl and 6 on the keyboard. Now we're going to be creating two different structures here. The very first is going to be responsible for defining the properties of each character. In this case, they'll have a name and they'll have a visual. Now the second structure, on the other hand, is going to be responsible for serving a collection of those characters to the interface, and will contain information like how many characters there are, and the unique name and the unique visual values for each of those characters. This will make a bit more sense once we start building it, but essentially our objective is to create a child-parent relationship between the first and the second structure. So let's go ahead and create our very first data structure, and this will be the one that contains our character properties. To do so, we'll navigate to the upper right-hand corner of the data panel, hit the plus, and then select structure. That'll create the structure and make it appear within the panel. Let's go ahead and rename this to character_viewModel. We'll then divert our attention to the right side of the application window into the properties panel, because what we'll be doing next is creating the two properties that will exist here. So we can go ahead and press this plus twice, one for each property, and we can then go ahead and set these up. Let's go ahead and start with the first one, which we'll go ahead and rename to character_name, and we'll set this to be a string between 1 and 2 words. We'll go ahead and expand the second one, and we'll go ahead and rename this to character_visual. Now we're going to go ahead and select string because what we'll be doing is we'll be using the names of the colors as they are defined in the framework. And this will be exactly 1 word. Next, we'll get to create our second data structure, and this will be the one that defines a collection of characters that will be served to the interface. So, almost identical process as to what we did before. We'll navigate to the upper right-hand corner of the data panel, hit the plus, and select structure. Let's go ahead and rename this to screen_viewModel, and once again we'll navigate to the right side of the application window and create a new property by hitting the plus. We'll go ahead and rename this to characters_collection. Now how this will differ from previously is instead of selecting string, we're going to go and select a source of character viewModel, which if you'll remember is the first data structure that we created that contains the character properties. Go ahead and select that, set it to serve a collection, and then we'll go ahead and set the bounds to be exactly 8 characters. So now that our data structures are set up, we can now start using them. However, one thing you may have noticed is that we've been spending time creating data properties without necessarily inputting the data values. And the reason why we haven't done this yet is that we'll first need to create what's called a data set to be able to do so. Now what a data set is, it's essentially a collection of values that follow the rules imposed upon it by its associated data structure. So to create a data set, all that we need to do is to go to the data panel, hover over the data structure we want to create a set from, and click on the plus icon. From there, we can go ahead and double click on the name and rename it to screen_data. Now what's really important to note about these data sets is that to be used and leveraged, they need to be assigned. Now we include a really handy feature within Noesis Studio that lets you automatically assign this data set to your page root. And we can do that by clicking on the house with the plus icon, which will assign the data set to the root. And we can see that this has worked because of the blue icon that has appeared on both the data set and on the page down below. Now in terms of actually filling out all of the data values for our individual characters, this is going to give us an amazing opportunity to discover another really cool Noesis Studio data feature. If you remember earlier, we spent some time setting constraints for our data structures. For example, that our collection would always be composed of exactly 8 characters, that our character name would always be between 1 and 2 words, and that our character visual would always be exactly 1 word. Well, within Noesis Studio, you can use these constraints and rules as a basis for our automatic data generation feature, which you can access by either hovering over the dataset in the data panel and clicking on the Generate Sample Data icon, or you can access the exact same feature within its properties with the same icon. Right now you can see that our data set on the right here is completely empty, but the moment we go ahead and click on this icon, it'll generate exactly 8 characters. But wait, there's more. If we go ahead and click on the Expand All Values button, you can also see that it has filled out all of the information here with placeholder values according to the rules that we set. So as you can see, the character names are all composed between 1 and 2 words, and the character visuals are all exactly 1 word. What a great head start! Next, let's take this foundation that's been automatically generated for us and customize it even further by inputting our very own custom values. Now you can have as much fun as you want here with the name of your characters. In our case, we'll be using names of members of our team and assigning each of them a specific color. So let's go ahead and get started and start filling this out. We'll go ahead and start with Jesus, who will be assigning a maroon. Sergio will be given a dark cyan. Juan, a goldenrod. Dario will be given the color Peru. Francesc will be given an olive. Mark, a steel blue. I'll be giving myself a dark green. And Jorge will give a coral. And that is everything accounted for in terms of inputting our data. We're now ready to move on to customizing the ListBox element. Now before we dig in, let's take a moment to understand what the ListBox is and how it works. Now at the essence, a ListBox element is able to display an array of items from a data source, and it's composed of 3 different templates. At the very bottom level, we'll find the item template, and this basically is responsible for displaying the individual unique items in this list box. Next, we have the item container, and this is the generic layer shared by each list item. In this case, it is the item container that dictates the hover state, as well as the selected state that is shared by all items. Finally, we'll find the items panel, and what this is responsible for is essentially for laying out how each of the items and the item containers will be laid out within the interface. So in this case, we can see that it is in a vertical stack panel, and we can change this as we want to, and that's one of the things that we'll be doing later. So that's an overview of the list box. Let's get to customizing it. Let's go ahead and first create a new template for our ListBox items panel. What this will allow us to do is to completely customize how our items are laid out on the page. Now it's super easy to create a new template for this. All that you need to do is to right click on the list box either in the navigator or on the stage as I'm doing now, and then we can head to the template section, to the items panel subsection, and then we can hit create. At this point, we'll just navigate over to the Resources tab on the far left of the application window, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl and 5 on the keyboard. Within here, we'll see that our new template has been created. Let's go ahead and double click on it and we'll rename it. So we'll go ahead and call this ListBox _items panel _template. And now it's time for the magic to happen. We want to convert what is now a vertical stack panel into a uniform grid that'll span the entire width and the allocated vertical space. So to do that, all that we need to do is to right click on the stack panel, either on the stage or within the navigator, head down to the layout section, to the replace with section, and then select uniform grid, and we'll click that and our layout will be completely adjusted. We also want to ensure that no matter what, our grid is always 4 columns wide. So what we'll do is we'll head to the properties for the grid, and in the columns field, we'll go ahead and type 4. At this point, we can now exit back to our main page, so we'll head down to the lower left-hand corner of the stage to the Return Scope button and click that, and we are now ready to continue our work. Now that we've created our layout, we can now start thinking about customizing our individual items. However, before we do, let's actually take a moment to hook up all of the data that we created earlier to this list box. What this will allow us to do is that it will allow the templates that we'll be creating next to actually access that data and use it to display data-specific content. So to make this hookup happen, all that we need to do is to select the list box either from the navigator or on the stage. Next, we'll be navigating to the Properties panel for this list box and navigating to the item's source property in particular. From there, we'll be clicking on the 3-dot menu on the right and selecting Create Binding. If we go ahead and then expand this Path section, we can then find Characters Collection within there. We'll go ahead and click that, and now this list box is hooked up to the data, and we can now proceed with creating the rest of the templates. For our next step, let's go ahead and create a template for our ListBox item. We'll be following an almost identical process to the one that we followed to create our ItemsPanel template, so let's go ahead and start by right-clicking on the ListBox, heading to the Templates menu, but this time we'll be selecting the Item subcategory. From here, we can go ahead and hit Create, and that'll create a resource for that template, as we can see in the Resources panel on the left in the application window. Let's go ahead and double-click on our new resource and rename it. And we'll call it ListBox_item_template. And we're now at a stage where we can start customizing the presentation and the internals of the ListBox item template. Within the ListBox item template, what we'll find is if we head down to the navigator in the lower left and expand the grid, we've already got a text block here. And this text block is going to be a perfect element for us to reuse to display the name of our character. So let's go ahead and hook this up to the data that we created earlier. To do so, we can simply click on the text block either within the navigator or directly on the stage. From there, we'll head to its Properties panel on the right of the window, and in particular, to the text property. We'll go ahead and hover over this row and click on the three-dot menu on the right, and then select Create Binding. Then, under the Context tab, we'll go ahead and open the Path Expander, and under the Character View model, we'll go ahead and select Character_name. The second we click that, all of our names will be updated with their values. Really cool, and one of my favorite parts of the process. Whilst we're here, let's go ahead and also polish the presentation of the text. We'll head down to the text section and set an alignment to center. Lastly, we'll also just go ahead and rename this text block to character_name_text block. And now we're at a point where we can continue with the rest of the layout of this template. In terms of the presentation of the character tile, we're going to be aiming for a two-row layout, in which in the bottom row will be the character name, and in the top row, in a nice large area above it, will be the character visual. So let's go ahead and adjust our layout to accommodate this. We're going to head to the navigator and simply select the grid. Next, let's go ahead and zoom in and get up close and personal to that grid's left edge, because we're going to be adding another row to it using the exact same method that we did to add two rows to our main page layout. So we'll go ahead and simply hover over its left edge, and as soon as we get that hover highlight with the new cursor that appears with the plus, we can click on the mouse and add our second row. Let's go ahead and now set the dimensions for our two rows. We'll start with the top row, which will be the one that the character's visual will be assigned to. We'll go ahead and simply change that to 1 star. Now for the second row, the bottom one, which the character's name will be assigned to, we're actually going to go ahead and change the unit of measurement that we're using. We're going to go ahead and click on the unit of measurement and change this from star to auto. Now, what setting it to auto will do was that it will scale to whatever size the elements within it are. In this case, it'll be the text block. So we'll have a bottom row that'll always scale its height to the height of the text block within. Combined with the 1-star character visual spot means that in essence, our layout will allow the bottom row to scale to the height of the text, and then our character visual, our top row, will always scale to whatever size it has available to grow into. So next, let's actually just go ahead and assign our text block to the correct row. To do that, we'll select it from the navigator. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and clear these local values that have found their way inside of this. To do so, we can use middle mouse click when we hover over any of the fields and press down on it. It'll clear that. In this case, you can see that we changed the width to auto. We'll do the same for the height. We'll clear the local 0 value on the margin. And then we actually want to make sure that we have the correct row for this text block. Right now, it's actually assigned to the wrong one. Row 0 is the row for the visual. So let's go ahead and just change row to 1, which will be the bottom row, and then we'll set a horizontal and vertical alignment to stretch so that it occupies the entirety of the space that is assigned to it. Next, let's go ahead and bring in the element that will support the display of the character visual. For our next step, we're going to navigate to the upper left-hand corner of the application window to the Add Element tab, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl+2 on the keyboard. From within there, we'll use the search bar at the top to look for the grid element. And once we've found it, we'll go ahead and click and drag it and introduce it into the template hierarchy and place it right below the text block. Whilst we're within the navigator, let's go ahead and just double-click on our newly introduced grid and rename it to character_visual_grid. We'll then divert our attention to its Properties panel on the right, and there are a couple of things that we need to resolve. Now, if you remember, we wanted our character visual to occupy the top row of the layout and the top row exclusively. However, we can see that it currently has a row span of 2, when in fact, we only want to have a row span of 1. We want to span its own row exclusively. So we'll go ahead and change this value from a 2 to a 1. The remaining issue that we have is it's currently assigned to row 1, which within this layout, row 1 is actually the bottom row, the row to which the character name is assigned. Instead, we want the character visual to be assigned to the top row, row 0. So let's go ahead and adjust that 1 to a 0, and now it is placed in the correct position. Next, let's go ahead and actually just bind the data to this. So we're going to go to the appearance section, and we're going to go to the background property, and on the 3-dot menu on the right, we'll go ahead and click on it, and then select Create Binding. Within the Context tab, if we expand the path, we'll then find our character underscore view model and its associated character underscore visual. The moment we click that, we'll actually see that the data has been passed through successfully because in the swatch next to the property, we can see the maroon that has been assigned to Jesus in data. Now, one thing you may notice is you cannot yet see the color on the stage. And the reason for that is because a lot of the height of this element is actually governed by our remaining ItemsContainer template. So we're going to go ahead and exit this template and start work on our remaining and final template. To create our ListBox ItemContainer template, we're going to right-click on the ListBox either within the navigator or directly on the stage. Then we'll navigate to the template section, and then under ItemContainer, we'll select Create. At this point, we'll navigate to the far left of the application window to the Resources tab, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl and 5 on the keyboard. Now within here, you'll notice that unlike the other two templates, this time both the template and the style have been created. The reason for this is because within the framework, the template must be assigned within a style. So when you create a template within Noesis Studio, we completely automate the process where we will create the required style and create the template and assign the template to the correct style. So at this point, let's go ahead and just rename both of these before we continue our customization of the template. We'll go ahead and start with the ListBox item style, which we'll go ahead and double click within the resources panel and rename to ListBox ItemContainer underscore style. We'll also do the same for the template, which we'll go ahead and double click and rename to ListBox ItemContainer underscore template. At this point, we can now start customizing the rest of the appearance of the internals of this template. For our very first step, let's go ahead and simply replace the default item border found within this template and swap it with a grid element. To do so, we can right-click on the item border within the navigator, head to the layout section, and then under Replace With, we'll select Grid. Let's go ahead and still stay within the navigator, and now we'll go ahead and just expand the grid. And within this, we'll find a content presenter element. Now, a content presenter is pretty much exactly as the name implies. It exists to present content. In the context of the list box, the content that it presents is the content of the ListBox item, which is the template that we created earlier that contains the unique character name and the unique character visual. Now, if we go to the properties panel on the right, we have a couple clues that will show us why our character visual has not been appearing. And in particular, if we look at the vertical alignment, it's currently set to center. Therefore, there is no room for the character visual to fill up and take up that space in display. So if we change our vertical alignment to stretch, all of our character colors will appear. Let's go ahead and also just change our horizontal alignment to stretch so it takes up the maximum amount of horizontal space as well. And at this point, we can now exit this template from the lower left-hand corner Return Scope button, and we can also exit the style in which it's contained by also pressing the Return Scope button in the lower left. Now at this point, we can proceed by customizing the elements of the screen, which will display the currently selected character. Now before we hook up our text block and our grid to reflect the currently selected character name and character visual respectively, there's still one more operation that we need to perform so that both of these elements can correctly interpret and display which of the characters is the currently selected one. And to do this, we're going to go ahead and select the grid either from the stage or within the navigator. Then we'll navigate to the properties, and in particular we'll go to the top of the panel and hit this expander. Here we can see that we have a selected index property. Now this selected index is currently set to -1. What's important to keep in mind here is that the first item in the list is 0. Therefore, this is actually not reflecting any currently selected item. So let's go ahead and click on this field and simply change the -1 to 0. And now the selected index will be the very first item in the array. Next, let's go ahead and actually select the text block. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go to the text property, click on the three-dot menu, and select Create Binding. Next, we're going to actually select the Name tab this time, as we're going to be targeting the ListBox elements by name. If we click on it, we can then select under the element name, Characters ListBox. Then, if we expand the path, we'll navigate down to the selected item. And what we'll find once we arrive there is that we can then select Character Name. If we click that, now the selected character will appear in that field. We'll do the exact same process for the grid, so we'll go ahead and select the grid from the stage or from the navigator, and this time, within the background property under the appearance section, we'll click on the three-dot menu, select Create Binding, go to Name once again, select the Characters ListBox, and then we'll expand this menu to look for the selected item. And then, once we've arrived there, we will now select Character Visual, and just like that, our name and background display the selected character. With that now complete, we've reached a super exciting phase of the exercise, because now we're going to be able to perform our very first functional test of the system that we've created and to ensure that everything is working as expected. So, for the moment of truth, we're going to engage play mode, and this can be done by either clicking the arrow at the very top of the screen or by pressing Ctrl P on the keyboard. Once this mode is engaged, we'll then be able to click on the individual character tiles within the screen, and we'll be able to observe that both the background as well as the text label are correctly updating to reflect the currently selected character. Now, we could benefit from a little bit of presentation polish here still, in particular increased contrast of the tile label, perhaps a more prominent hover state when mousing over each tile, and we could also benefit from a selected state on each tile to display that it is currently the selected one. So let's go ahead and exit play mode, and we'll move on to making those changes next. Now, since we'll be making changes to the generic interaction layer of the character tile, we're going to go ahead and make these adjustments within the ListBox ItemContainer template. And this can be accessed by either right-clicking on the ListBox within the navigator or on the stage, navigating to the template section, ItemContainer, and then selecting Edit Current. We'll also just go ahead and expand the grid within the navigator and see what's inside. We're going to be adding 2 rectangle elements to this hierarchy. So next, we'll also navigate to the far left of the application window to the Add Element tab, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl 2 on the keyboard. From within the panel, we're going to go ahead and do a search for the rectangle element, and we'll drag in 2 instances of this to the hierarchy, one below the content presenter and one above the content presenter. We'll then go ahead and double click on both of these and rename them. We'll start with the lower one. We'll go ahead and rename it to ListBox ItemContainer _ Backer. This is going to be the background for the tile. We'll then double click on the one above and rename it to ListBox ItemContainer _ Outline. Now, since we know that this is going to be an outline only, we can see that in the Properties panel it has a fill, which it does not need. So we'll go ahead and hover over that row, click on the 3-dot menu, and select Clear Local Value. Now, we'll be able to see our backer through it. However, there are some contrast issues, so let's go ahead and select our backer and change the fill color by clicking on the Properties swatch and then clicking and dragging to the lower left into the black. Perfect. Next, this is going to be a fill only, so it actually strictly doesn't need a stroke. So we can do the exact same operation that we did on the outline, except on the stroke of this one, where we'll hover over it, click on the 3-dot menu, and clear the local value. The last thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make some adjustments to the root grid. Now, one thing that we know we want to happen is that when you hover over this tile, it grows a little bit from the center. So let's go ahead and set that up for success. We're going to go to the Transform section in the Properties, to the Render Transform subsection, to the Origin tab on the far right. We're going to simply click in the middle of this graph to change the origin to 0.5, 0.5, which corresponds to the center of the tile. The very last thing we'll do here is we'll just go ahead and add a margin all around this of 16 pixels, which will give it a little bit of room to breathe and also give it some room to expand on that hover. Next, we get to actually play with the visual states and set up our selected state and our hover state. So let's go do that next. For our last bit of work together, we're going to navigate over to the far left of the application window to the Animation tab, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl and 4 on the keyboard. Once within this tab, and especially within the Visual State subtab, we'll be greeted by a plethora of visual states that come prefabricated and pre-working as part of the ListBox item container template. And they're going to be really easy for us to leverage. In particular, we're going to be interested in the mouse over visual state as well as the selected visual state. So let's go ahead and first click on the mouse over visual state. The second that we do this, we'll notice two changes appearing in the center area of the screen. The very first is that our stage becomes adorned with a red outline, and the second is that a timeline has appeared from the bottom of the screen. Now, what this red outline represents is that any change that we make on the stage or in the properties will be keyed as a keyframe within the timeline. So in the case of us wanting to have this grid scale on hover, we can simply navigate to the properties panel, go down to the transform, render transform section, and change the scale from 1 to 1.05 for both scale X and scale Y. And now if we toggle between no state applied and mouse over, you can see that it scales up slightly. Awesome, let's go ahead and move on to the selected state next. So we'll go ahead and click on selected, and now we can do a very similar process. Now, what we want to do is we want this outline to become white. So first of all, we'll go ahead and select the ListBox item container outline. We're going to go ahead and change the stroke color to white by clicking on the swatch within the property and then clicking and dragging to the upper left-hand corner of the color picker, and that is now white. Awesome. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to want this outline to actually swirl around the frame continuously for as long as the character is selected. So I'm just going to temporarily change the thickness of this to a little bit bigger so we can actually see what we're doing. But then what we're going to do is we're going to, under the expander for visibility, head down to the trim end section. And on our first frame, we're going to change this down to 0, because this is essentially the animation that's going to happen. So we'll move it down to 0. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and move our playhead by clicking and dragging on the timeline to the 1 second mark. And we will simply click and drag our trim end property back to 100. And now what we will get is this sort of animation. But the problem that we have now is that this only plays once. We want to repeat forever. So within the timeline, you'll see this button that says repeat forever is off. We'll go ahead and click that, and now it'll play repeatedly and forever for as long as the character is selected. Let's go ahead and just make a quick couple changes to reduce the thickness of that line. And we'll go ahead and just change that back to 1, and we'll make sure that it is applied on both, and that looks perfect. For the grand reveal of our final product, let's go ahead and engage play mode by clicking on the arrow in the upper center of the screen or by pressing Ctrl-P on the keyboard. With this mode engaged, we can then move our mouse into the screen and observe that the character tiles are all successfully displaying the mouse over state that we created, where the tile scales up on hover. Additionally, we can click on any of the character tiles and see that it is correctly reflecting the currently selected character in the background, in the text label, as well as through a selected item marquee circulating around the character tile itself. Super cool, and that's all that it takes to create a data-driven interface within Noesis Studio. Now this is obviously a relatively simple example, and you can really carry these exact same techniques into varying levels of complexity. If you want to see a couple examples of what that looks like, the squad, Ombra, and engineering samples included within Noesis Studio are a great place to start. We hope you found this both enjoyable and useful. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you for the next one.